In 1922, James Weldon Johnson, actually the only person in the black tradition that would ever even think about writing a biography of, was James Weldon Johnson. James Weldon Johnson, in his introduction to his important anthology, the first great anthology of African American literature, published in 1922, had this to say about the role of Negro literature. A people may become great through many means, but there is only one measure by which its greatness is recognized and acknowledged. The final measure of the greatness of all peoples is the amount and standard of the literature and art they have produced. The world does not know that a people is great until that people produces great literature and art. No people that produces great literature and art has ever been looked upon by the world as distinctly inferior. A heavy load to place on literature and art. Now, black writers have been wrestling with this matter of the nature and function of our literature at least since the 18th century, with dear Phyllis Wheatley, weighing concerns with race matters against concerns with craft matters. Does race still matter? Of course it does. But craft matters just as much. That is, it matters just as much if you really want to create art. The writers that we have gathered together for this series take for granted the simple proposition that the particularity of the black experience is the stuff of art, not as a sociological or an anthropological phenomenon, but as a conduit through which one passes into the larger human experience. These writers take their rightful place as citizens of the Republic of Letters, as my hero, the great Du Bois, put it, and you could see him in bronze up on the second floor at the conclusion of our event. I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come, all graciously, with no scorn nor condescension. So, wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Is this the life you grudge us, O knightly America? Is this the life you long to change into the dull red hideousness of Georgia? Well, to celebrate our little canton within the great Republic of Letters, and as a reward to ourselves and ointment to ourselves after a difficult and traumatic year, last year, I wanted to bring some of my favorite writers, and indeed some of the great writers of our time, to Harvard to share with you their arts, their craft, their visions, their passions. And I'm pleased that we are commencing a 6-week series today with my dear friends, Jamaica Kincaid and Andrea Lee. And here to introduce, are we going to start with Andrea or Jamaica? With Jamaica. Here to introduce Jamaica is my colleague in the English department, Professor Philip James Fisher, the Felice Crowell Reed Professor of English and American Literature.
As one of the fully achieved voices of our time, Jamaica Kincaid, like all great writers, is a part of the memory of people she's never met. Many of them think through her thoughts in languages that she herself does not speak, German, Japanese, Chinese. People who feel that they know themselves more certainly because of the way they know her, and those territories of experience they only know through the cadence and affect, the strong line of her style. In her most recent 3 books, novels, memoirs, meditations, histories of the incomplete self, Autobiography of My Mother, My Brother, Mr. Potter, and above all, in the last of these books, published this year, she has worked through an essential meditation on incomplete being. In these recent books, the historical malice or damage that is race and conquest, and the historical magic that is immigration, self-invention, the right never to return or reconcile or diminish anger, are threaded together, displayed as in an aria that singles out certain words or phrases for iteration, for lyrical contemplation, encirclement, exploratory, multiplied feeling. Within Mr. Potter, a book that appeared within the last year, we find what appears to be memory, and memory's search to record and to understand, but memory without forgiveness or mercy, memory in search of justice, even judgment, like the Last Judgment where nothing is forgiven or softened by the passage of time, where no reconciliation is offered or possible. These problems of unconsoled memory have specific historical topics for all of us in the last 50 years. The Holocaust, the matter of race and conquest, but they also have at heart the same refusal to forgive or permit the changes of time and distance to count or to mollify that we find in Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov's refusal of the idea of heaven if it might include any of those who'd brought the most unthinkable suffering to children. Suffering he read about in the daily newspaper. Not all individual or group experience of injustice converts in being written down by those who have experienced malice and suffering to the Dickensian bittersweet recreation by the now safely achieved adult mind and spirit. Jamaica Kincaid has designed an anti-Dickensian novel for persons where becoming falls short, for those who only in part achieve personal being, life history, presence in place and time, known to themselves and in intimacy to others, owning a language for their own condition and presence in that language to themselves and to others. All that we call character in fiction, or selfhood in life. Her subject is to give a shadow on the page to those who might have been, might have known themselves and their condition, whose possible self might be imagined by an author only in ways that fall short of being that one thing they might have been able to be. Those who emigrate, as Jamaica Kincaid did, those who rename themselves, as Jamaica Kincaid did, have a unique purchase in their artistic imagination on that other possible starved life, not lived, unflowered, that life, for example, that might have been lived by the person who did not carry her own discarded early name into an adult life, or that life lived by herself in the place abandoned with the refused limitations and possibilities refused in the act of immigration. Jamaica Kincaid has said, "Only by going to a court of justice could I have done what I did by writing." Her writing is never a form of plea, to use a term from the courtroom. It has the harsh factual certainty of those who have had to refuse to lie, accommodate, or pardon. Like all acts done in the name of personal and collective justice, her writing dissolves anger, mourning, into the hard results of speaking and remembering. Jamaica Kincaid will read today from her early work, At the Bottom of the River. Jamaica Kincaid.
Sorry, that's my daughter Annie, who's trying to make me even more nervous. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much for that wonderful introduction. I can hardly believe I've written anything that deserves such consideration, but I thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I know this woman from when, I don't know if I should even, when I was in my 20s. I don't know how old she was then, but we were both writers at the New Yorker, and the funny thing is, I think Andrea, I'd been there before before you, so you might have been the fourth black writer at the New Yorker. I was the third. I think I was the second black talk reporter. The first was Charlene Hunter Galt. That was how big a time it was. And I don't remember thinking, oh, there are no black people here, because I never thought, oh, there are no black people here. I just assumed everyone was black because I grew up with only black people. So I didn't notice that there weren't any. I just made everyone black. I thought I would read these stories from my 20s. The first things I wrote, the first kind of fiction I wrote, and I remember I said this to Professor Fisher once, that I wrote these stories because it's the sort of thing you do when you're young. You're just horrible when you're young, and you should be horrible when you're young, because it doesn't look good when you're old to be horrible. I used to think that if only I wrote a certain kind of thing, all sorts of writing would just never be done again. And a lot of the writing I thought that about was in the New Yorker at the time. And now I just can't imagine what ever made me do that. But this is the sort of thing I used to write. And I just wanted to write a kind of fiction that had never been done before. And it's not possible, really. You just do what, you know. You shouldn't even think like that, but I did when I was young. So it's just in honor of our youth, I thought I would read the first things I wrote. They're very, very short, and anyway, I'll just read them. It's from At the Bottom of the River. The first one is called What I Have Been Doing Lately. What I have been doing lately. I was lying in bed and the doorbell rang. I ran downstairs. Quick! I opened the door. There was no one there. I stepped outside. Either it was drizzling or there was a lot of dust in the air, and the dust was damp. I stuck out my tongue, and the drizzle or the damp dust tasted like government school ink. I looked north. I looked south. I decided to start walking north. While walking north, I noticed that I was barefoot. While walking north, I looked up and saw the planet Venus. I said, it must be almost morning. I saw a monkey in a tree. The tree had no leaves. I said, ah, a monkey. Just look at that, a monkey. I walked for I don't know how long before I came up to a big body of water. I wanted to get across it, but I couldn't swim. I wanted to get across it, but it would take me years to build a boat. I wanted to get across it, but it would take me, I didn't know how long, to build a bridge. Years passed, and then one day, feeling like it, I got into my boat and rowed across. When I got to the other side, it was noon, and my shadow was small and fell beneath me. I set out on a path that stretched out straight ahead. I passed a house, and a dog was sitting on the veranda, but it looked the other way when it saw me coming. I passed a boy tossing a ball in the air, but the boy looked the other way when he saw me coming. I walked and I walked, but I couldn't tell if I walked a long time because my feet didn't feel as if they would drop off. I turned around to see what I had left behind me, but nothing was familiar. Instead of the straight path, I saw hills. Instead of the boy with his ball, I saw tall flowering trees. I looked up, and the sky was without clouds and seemed near, as if it were the ceiling in my house, and if I stood on a chair, I could touch it with the tips of my fingers. I turned around and looked ahead of me again. A deep hole had opened up before me. I looked in. But the hole was deep and dark, and I couldn't see the bottom. I thought, what's down there? So on purpose I fell in. I fell and I fell over and over, as if I were an old suitcase. On the sides of the deep hole I could see things written, but perhaps it was in a foreign language because I couldn't read them. Still I fell, for I don't know how long. As I fell, I began to see that I didn't like the way falling made me feel. Falling made me feel sick, and I missed all the people I had loved. I said, I don't want to fall anymore, and I reversed myself. I was standing again on the edge of the deep hole. I looked up at the deep hole. I looked at the deep hole, and I said, you can close up now, and it did. I walked some more without knowing distance. I only knew that I passed through days and nights. I only knew that I passed through rain and shine, light and darkness. I was never thirsty, and I felt no pain. Looking at the horizon, I made a joke for myself. I said, "The earth has thin lips," and I laughed. Looking at the horizon again, I saw a lone figure coming towards me, but I wasn't frightened because I was sure it was my mother. As I got closer to the figure, I could see that it wasn't my mother, but still I wasn't frightened because I could see that it was a woman. When this woman got closer to me, she looked at me hard, and then she threw up her hands. She must have seen me somewhere before, because she said, "It's you, just look at that, it's you, and just what have you been doing lately?" I could have said, "I have been praying not to grow any taller." I could have said, "I have been listening carefully to my mother's words so as to make a good imitation of a dutiful daughter." I could have said, "A pack of dogs, tired from chasing each other all over town, slept in the moonlight. Instead, I said, "What I have been doing lately. I was lying in bed on my back, my hands drawn up, my fingers interlaced lightly at the nape of my neck. Someone rang the doorbell. I went downstairs and opened the door, but there was no one there. I stepped outside. Either it was drizzling or there was a lot of dust in the air, and the dust was damp. I stuck out my tongue, and the drizzle or the damp dust tasted like government school ink. I looked north and I looked south. I started walking north. While walking north, I wanted to move fast, so I removed the shoes from my feet. While walking north, I looked up and saw the planet Venus, and I said, if the sun went out, it would be 8 minutes before I would know it. I saw a monkey sitting in a tree that had no leaves, and I said, "A monkey, just look at that, a monkey." So I picked up a stone and threw it at the monkey. The monkey, seeing the stone, quickly moved out of its way. 3 times I threw a stone at the monkey, and 3 times it moved away. The 4th time I threw the stone, the monkey caught it and threw it back at me. The stone struck me on my forehead over my right eye, making a deep gash. The gash healed immediately, but now the skin on my forehead felt false to me. I walked for I don't know how long before I came to a big body of water. I wanted to get across, so when the boat came, I paid my fare. When I got to the other side, I saw a lot of people sitting on the beach, and they were having a picnic. They were the most beautiful people I had ever seen. Everything about them was black and shiny. Their skin was black and shiny. Their shoes were black and shiny. Their hair was black and shiny. The clothes they wore were black and shiny. I could hear them laughing and chatting, and I said, I would like to be with these people, so I started to walk towards them. But when I got up close to them, I saw that they weren't at a picnic, and they weren't beautiful, and they weren't chatting and laughing. All around me was black mud, and the people all looked as if they had been made up out of the black mud. I looked up and saw that the sky seemed far away, and nothing I could stand on would make me able to touch it with my fingertips. I thought, if only I could get out of this, so I started to walk. I must have walked for a long time, because my feet hurt and felt as if they would drop off. I thought, if only just around the bend I would see my house, and inside my house I would find my bed, freshly made at that, and in the kitchen I would find my mother or anyone else that I loved, making me a custard. I thought, if only it was a Sunday and I was sitting in a church and I had just heard someone sing a psalm. I felt very sad, so I sat down. I felt so sad that I'd rested my head on my own knees and smoothed my own head. I felt so sad I couldn't imagine feeling any other way again. I said, I don't like this. I don't want to do this anymore. And I went back to lying in bed just before the doorbell rang. In some ways, I was writing the same thing, trying to perfect something, because here's a story I wrote that most of the stories, there are 10 stories in this book, and 7 of them appeared in the New Yorker, and why the other 3 didn't, because they were all submitted, I don't know. Because they really, I don't even know how they ended up in the magazine at all. They were so weird. But this story, the editor, you'll see, it's written in sections. It begins, the sections end, and the story begins as if it's a new beginning. It is a new beginning. But the editor liked it very much, and he was always fighting with the fiction department over my work. They never liked it. And this story, he tried very hard to get them to publish, and he would rearrange. He submitted it about 4 times. He would rearrange the sections, and I think he even had his secretary retype it so that they would think it was a completely different story. And then finally he gave up. I remember the editor, Veronica Gang, and she's a good friend of mine. And, but anyway, she called up and she said, "We're not buying your story. Nobody liked it." And consequently, it's one of my favorite stories. And, because nobody likes it. You have to like the things of yours that nobody else likes. It's called My Mother, and it's in sections, you'll see. Immediately on wishing my mother dead and seeing the pain it caused her, I was sorry and cried so many tears that all the earth around me was drenched. Standing before my mother, I begged her forgiveness, and I begged so earnestly that she took pity on me, kissing my face and placing my head on her bosom to rest. Placing her arms around me, she drew my head closer and closer to her bosom until finally I suffocated. I lay on her bosom, breathless, for a time uncountable, until one day, for a reason she has kept to herself, she shook me out and stood me under a tree, and I started to breathe again. I cast a sharp glance at her and said to myself, "So." Instantly, I grew my own bosoms, small mounds at first, leaving a small, soft place between them where, if ever necessary, I could rest my own head. Between my mother and me now were the tears I had cried, and I gathered up some stones and banked them in so that they formed a small pond. The water in the pond was thick and black and poisonous, so that only unnameable invertebrates could live in it. My mother and I now watched each other carefully, always making sure to shower the other with words and deeds of love and affection. I was sitting on my mother's bed trying to get a good look at myself. It was a large bed, and it stood in the middle of a large, completely dark room. The room was completely dark because all the windows had been boarded up and all the crevices stuffed with black cloth. My mother lit some candles, and the room burst into a pink-like, yellow-like glow. Looming over us, much larger than ourselves, were our shadows. We sat mesmerized because our shadows had made a place between themselves, as if they were making room for someone else. Nothing filled up the space between them and the shadow of my mother sighed. The shadow of my mother danced around the room to a tune that my own shadow sang, and then they stopped. All along, our shadows had grown thick and thin, long and short, had fallen at every angle, as if they were controlled by the light of day. Suddenly, my mother got up and blew out the candles, and our shadows vanished. I continued to sit on the bed, trying to get a good look at myself. My mother removed her clothes and covered thoroughly her skin with a thick gold-colored oil, which had recently been rendered in a hot pan from the livers of reptiles with pouched throats. She grew plates of metal-colored scales on her back, and light, when it collided with this surface, would shatter and collapse into tiny points. Her teeth now arranged themselves into rows that reached all the way back to her long white throat. She uncoiled her hair from her head and then removed her hair altogether. Taking her head into her large palms, she flattened it so that her eyes, which were by now ablaze, sat on top of her head and spun like 2 revolving balls. Then, making 2 lines on the soles of each foot, she divided her feet into crossroads. Silently, she had instructed me to follow her example, and now I too traveled along on my white underbelly, my tongue darting and flickering in the hot air. "Look," said my mother. My mother and I were standing on the seabed side by side, my arms laced loosely around her waist, my head resting securely on her shoulder, as if I needed the support. To make sure she believed in my frailness, I sighed occasionally, long soft sighs, the kind of sigh she had long ago taught me could evoke sympathy. In fact, how I really felt was invincible. I was no longer a child, but I was not yet a woman. My skin had just blackened and cracked and fallen away, and my new impregnable carapace had taken full hold. My nose had flattened, my hair curled in and stood out straight from my head simultaneously. My many rows of teeth in their retractable trays were in place. My mother and I wordlessly made an arrangement. I sent out my beautiful sighs, she received them. I leaned ever more heavily on her for support. She offered her shoulder, which shortly grew to the size of a thick plank. A long time passed, at the end of which I had hoped to see my mother permanently cemented to the seabed. My mother reached out to pass a hand over my head, a pacifying gesture, but I laughed and, with great agility, stepped aside. I let out a horrible roar, then a self-pitying whine. I had grown big, but my mother was bigger, and that would always be so. We walked to the garden of fruits, and there ate to our heart's satisfaction. We departed through the southwesterly gate, leaving, as always, in our trail, small colonies of worms. With my mother, I crossed unwillingly the valley. We saw a lamb grazing, and when it heard our footsteps, it paused and looked up at us. The lamb looked cross and miserable. I said to my mother, "The lamb is cross and miserable. So would I be too, if I had to live in a climate not suited to my nature." My mother and I now entered the cave. It was the dark and cold cave. I felt something growing under my feet, and I bent down to eat it. I stayed that way for years, bent over eating whatever I found growing under my feet. Eventually, I grew a special lens that would allow me to see in the darkest of darkness. Eventually, I grew a special coat that kept me warm in the coldest of coldness. One day I saw my mother sitting on a rock. She said, "What a strange expression you have on your face, so cross, so miserable, as if you were living in a climate not suited to your nature." Laughing, she vanished. I dug a deep, deep hole. I built a beautiful house, a floorless house, over the deep, deep hole. I put lattice windows, most favored of windows by my mother, so perfect for looking out at people passing by without her being observed. I painted the house itself yellow, the windows green, colors I knew would please her. Standing just outside the door, I asked her to inspect the house. I said, "Take a look. Tell me if it's to your satisfaction." Laughing out of the corner of her mouth I could not see, she stepped inside. I stood just outside the door, listening carefully, hoping to hear her land with a thud at the bottom of the deep, deep hole. Instead, she walked up and down in every direction, even pounding her heel on the air. Coming outside to greet me, she said, "It is an excellent house. I would be honored to live in it," and then vanished. I filled up the hole and burnt the house to the ground. My mother has grown to an enormous height. I have grown to an enormous height also, but my mother's height is 3 times mine. Sometimes I cannot see from her breasts on up, so lost is she in the atmosphere. One day, seeing her sitting on the seashore, her hand reaching out in the deep to caress the belly of a striped fish as he swam through a place where 2 seas met, I glowed red with anger. For a while then, I lived alone on the island where there were 8 full moons, and I adorned the face of each moon with expressions I had seen on my mother's face. All the expressions favored me. I soon grew tired of living in this way and returned to my mother's side. I remained, though, glowing red with anger, and my mother and I built houses on opposite banks of the dead pond. The dead pond lay between us. In it, only small invertebrates with poisonous lances lived. My mother behaved towards them as if she had suddenly found herself in the same room with relatives we had long since risen above. I cherished their presence and gave them names. Still, I missed my mother's close company and cried constantly for her, but at the end of each day when I saw her return to her house, incredible and great deeds in her wake, each of them singing loudly her praises, I glowed and glowed again, red with anger. Eventually I wore myself out and sank into a deep, deep sleep, the only dreamless sleep I have ever had. One day my mother packed my things in a grip and, taking me by the hand, walked me to the jetty, placed me on board a boat in care of the captain. My mother, while caressing my chin and cheeks, said some words of comfort to me because we had never been apart before. She kissed me on the forehead and turned and walked away. I cried so much, my chest heaved up and down, my whole body shook at the sight of her back turned towards me, as if I had never seen her back turned towards me before. I started to make plans to get off the boat, but when I saw that the boat was encased in a large green bottle, as if it were about to decorate a mantelpiece, I fell asleep until I reached my destination, the new island. When the boat stopped, I got off and I saw a woman with feet exactly like mine, especially around the arch of the instep. Even though the face was completely different from what I was used to, I recognized this woman as my mother. We greeted each other at first with great caution and politeness, but as we walked along, our steps became one, and as we talked, our voices became one voice, and we were in complete union in every other way. What peace came over me then, for I could not see where she left off and I began, or where I left off and she began. My mother and I walked through the rooms of her house. Every crack on the floor holds a significant event. Here, an apparently healthy young man suddenly dropped dead. Here, a young woman defied her father, and while riding her bicycle to the forbidden lovers' meeting place, fell down a precipice, remaining a cripple for the rest of a very long life. My mother and I find this a beautiful house. The rooms are large and empty, opening onto each other, waiting for people and things to fill them up. Our white muslin skirts billow up around our ankles. Our hair hangs straight down our backs as our arms hang straight at our sides. I fit perfectly in the crook of my mother's arm, on the curve of her back, in the hollow of her stomach. We eat from the same bowl, drink from the same cup. When we sleep, our heads rest on the same pillow. As we walk through the rooms, we merge and separate, merge and separate. Soon we shall enter the final stage of our evolution. The fishermen are coming in from sea. Their catch is bountiful. My mother has seen to that. As the waves plop, plop against each other, the fishermen are happy that the sea's calm. My mother points out the fishermen to me. Their contentment is a source of my contentment. I am sitting in my mother's enormous lap. Sometimes I sit on a mat she has made for me from her hair. The lime trees are weighed down with limes. I have already perfumed myself with their blossoms. A hummingbird has nested on my stomach, a sign of my fertileness. My mother and I live in a bower made from flowers whose petals are imperishable. There is the silvery blue of the sea, crisscrossed with sharp darts of light. There is the warm rain falling on the clumps of casterbush. There is a small lamb bounding across the pasture. There is the soft ground welcoming the soles of my pink feet. It is in this way my mother and I have lived for a long time now. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you, Jamaica. That was wonderful. And now, here to introduce Andrea Lee is my colleague, Professor Lawrence Buell, the Powell M. Cabot Professor of American Literature and the Chairman of the Department of English.
I'm delighted to have the chance to introduce Andrea Lee to this company. a most accomplished fiction and nonfiction writer whose international fame is sure to continue to grow. Perhaps best known for her short stories, several of which appear in the O. Henry Best Short Story Anthologies that many of you, I'm sure, know. Of her most recent collection of short stories, Interesting Women, Philip Roth declares, "Andrea Lee is the real thing. There is nothing more to say." That's pretty good. Wouldn't we all love to have that kind of tribute? And it challenges me to see if I can say more. From my standpoint, one of the special things about her writing is wherever she or the narrative voice situates itself in the world, there seems to be an uncanny peripheral vision in glimpses of everything else that there is in the world. I don't know how you do it, and maybe you're not sure yourself, having just today come from Torino to Boston, and the head in one place and the body in another. There's an uncanniness of microvision, too, in the stories as well. One-liners like, impromptu confession can be as irresistible as sex. Yes. Or when a story speaks of the buzzing mental clarity that comes from exhaustion. Have you felt that? Yes. Yes. Andrea Lee's fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Book Review, New York Times Book Review, Vogue, Time, and the Oxford American. Her first novel was Sarah Phillips. Her second, Russian Journal. Russian Journal was nominated for a National Book Award and won the Gene Stein Award from the National Academy of Arts and Letters. The Times Book Review describes this work as such a subtly crafted reflection. Its tones belong more to the realm of poetry than journalism. Russian Journal inspires longing for more of the art, the author's perceptions on a variety of subjects, and I think the sense of slightly blurred genres or getting the synergy from different genres is very true. A Philadelphian by birth, Andrea Lee received her bachelor's and master's degree from here, from Harvard, so we dare to lay claim. And I understand that she's about to become a Harvard parent, too. Congratulations.
That's the funny thing. Our daughters are entering the same year.
Concurrency, synergy. Skip has arranged this beautifully. Andrea Lee's beautifully crafted stories from which she will, in just a moment, read two examples, offer, I think, this rare combination of essential evocation of the moment and profound insight into the struggles worldwide across cultural and national divides of gender, race, and class. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Lee.
Well, I'm not going to be quite as coherent and articulate as Jamaica, and I have an excuse that I've just flown in, so I'm stumbling a little bit as I talk. So I think the best thing to do would be to start reading. When I was listening to Jamaica, I remembered what it was like being at the New Yorker with her, and I always had the feeling of being hopelessly conventional whenever I was, even when we went shopping. You bought the wonderful white dress, and I was wearing a little ruffle-necked blouse, and that kind of summed things up. So I thought what I would do is read from the first piece of fiction I actually published in the New Yorker, which was published about the same time that we were going shopping together, sneaking off in the afternoons. And that is actually one of the first stories in Sarah Phillips, which is called New African. And it actually originated, I had the idea originally of writing an article about my father's church in Philadelphia, which is very similar, though not identical, to the church in this book. And William Shawn saw the beginnings of the article and said, well, this sounds like a story. Why don't you make it into a story? And it kind of turned into a story, and then it grew into a book. So I thought it might be nice to look back. I haven't read this for years and years. It's kind of funny to me. I will just read part of it, and the part that starts in the middle that is describing Sarah at the scene of baptism. Sarah is a preacher's daughter, and she, in New African, in this story, she's about 9 years old, and she has mixed feelings about her father's old Philadelphia church. And I'll just start. When Daddy had spoken the final words of the sermon, he drank a glass of water and vanished through a set of red velvet curtains to the right of the altar. The organist struck 2 deep chords, and the lights in the church went low. A subtle stir ran through the congregation, and I moved closer to my mother. This was a moment that fascinated and disturbed me more than anything else at church, the prelude to the ceremony of baptism. Deacon West rose and drew open the draperies that had been closed around the baptismal pool, and there stood my father in water to his waist. The choir began to sing. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Down the aisle, guided by 2 church mothers, came a procession of 8 children and adolescents. They wore white robes, the girls with white ribbons in their hair, and they all had solemn expressions of terror on their faces. I knew each one of them. There was Billy Price, a big, slow-moving boy of 13, the son of Deacon Price. There were the Duckery twins. There was Caroline Piggy, whom I hated because of her long, soft black curls, her dimpled pink face, and her lisp that ravished grown-ups. My mother gave me a nudge. "Run up to the side of the pool," she whispered. It was a custom for unbaptized children to watch the ceremony from the front of the church. They sat on the knees of the deacons and church mothers, and it was not unusual for a child to volunteer then and there for next month's baptism. I made my way quickly down the dark aisle, feeling the carpet slip under the smooth soles of my patent leather shoes. When I reached the side of the pool, I sat down in the bony lap of Bessie Gray, an old woman who often took care of my brother Matthew and me when our parents were away. We called her Aunt Bessie. She was a fanatically devout Christian whose strict ideas on child rearing had evolved over decades of domestic service to a rich white family in Delaware. The link between us, a mixture of hostility and grudging affection, had been forged over hours of pitched battles over bedtimes and proper behavior. Her worshipful respect for my father, whom she called the Rev, was exceeded only by her pride, the malice-tinged pride of an omniscient family servant in her white children, to whom she often unflatteringly compared Matthew and me. It was easy to see why my mother and her circle of fashionable matrons described Bessie Gray as archaic. One had only to look at her black straw hat, attached with 3 enormous pins to her knot of frizzy white hair. Her lean, brown-skinned face was dominated by a hawk nose inherited from some Indian ancestor and punctuated by a big black mole. Her eyes were small, shrewd, and baleful. She talked in ways that were already passing into history and parody, and she wore thick orange face powder that smelled like dead leaves. I leaned against her spare bosom and watched the other children clustered near the pool, their bonnets and hair ribbons and round heads outlined in the dim light. For a moment it was very still. The candidates for baptism, looking stiff and self-conscious, stood lined up in the short stairway leading to the pool. Sue Ann Ivory fiddled with her sleeve and then put her fingers in her mouth. Daddy spoke the opening phrases of the ceremony. In the Baptist Church, we do not baptize infants, but believe that a person must choose salvation for himself.
I didn't listen to the words. What I noticed was the music of the whole, how the big voice darkened and lightened in tone, and how the grand architecture of the biblical sentences ennobled the voice. The story was, of course, about Jesus and John the Baptist. One phrase struck me newly each time: "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Daddy sang out these words in a clear, triumphant tone, and the choir echoed him. Ever since I could understand it, this phrase had made me feel melancholy. It seemed to expose a hard knot of disobedience that had always lain inside me. When I heard it, I thought enviously of my brother Matthew, who was already baptized, and for whom life seemed to be a sedate and ordered affair. He, not I, was a child in whom a father could be pleased. Daddy beckoned to Billy Price, the first baptismal candidate, and Billy, ungainly in his white robe, descended the steps into the pool. In slow, soft voices, the choir began to sing, "Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water, God's going to trouble the water." Daddy told me this was the same song that the slaves had sung long ago in the South when they gathered to be baptized in rivers and streams. Although I cared little about history and found it hard to picture the slaves as being any ancestors of mine, I could clearly imagine them coming together beside a muddy river that wound away between trees drooping with strange vegetation. They walked silently in lines, their faces very black against their white clothes, leading their children. The whole scene was bathed in the heavy golden light that meant age and solemnity, the same light that seemed to weigh down the Israelites in illustrated volumes of Bible stories that shone now from the baptismal pool. All attention in the darkened auditorium was now focused on the pool, where between the red curtains my father stood holding Billy Price by the shoulders. Daddy stared into Billy's face, and the boy stared back, his lips set and trembling. "And now, by the power invested in me," said Daddy, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." As he pronounced these words, he conveyed a tenderness as efficient and impersonal as a physician's professional manner. Beneath it, however, I could see a private gladness, the same delight that transformed his face when he preached his sermon. He paused to flick a drop of water off his forehead, and then, with a single powerful motion of his arms, he laid Billy Price back into the water as if he were putting an infant to bed. I caught my breath as the boy went backward. When he came up, sputtering, 2 church mothers helped him out of the pool and through a doorway into a room where he'd be dried and dressed. One by one, the baptismal candidates descended the steps. After Wendell Cullen had left the water, glancing uneasily back at the wet robe trailing behind him, Daddy stood alone among the curtains and the mirrors. The moving reflections from the pool made the stuffed dove hanging over him seem to flutter on its string. "Dear Lord," said Daddy, as Jordan Grimes struck a chord, "bless these children who have chosen to be baptized in accordance with your teaching and who have been reborn to carry out your work. And each of them, surely you are well pleased." He paused, staring out into the auditorium. "And if there's anyone out there, man, woman, child, who wishes to be baptized next month, let him come forward now." Just then, Aunt Bessie gave me a shake and whispered sharply, "Go on up and accept Jesus." I stiffened and dug my bitten fingernails into my palms. The last clash of wills I'd had with Aunt Bessie had been when she, crazily set in her old Southern attitudes, had tried to make me wear an enormous straw hat, as her white children did, when I played outside in the sun. The old woman had driven me to madness, and I'd ended up spanked and sullen, crouching moodily under the dining room table. But this was different, outrageous, none of her business, I thought. I shook my head violently, and she took advantage of the darkness in the church to seize both of my shoulders and jounce me with considerable roughness, whispering, "Now listen, young lady. Your daddy up there is calling you to Christ. Your big brother's already offered his soul to the Lord. Now daddy wants his little girl to step forward." "No, he doesn't." I glanced at the baptismal pool where my father was clasping the hand of a strange man who had come up to him. I hoped this would distract Aunt Bessie, but she was tireless. "Your Mama and your Aunt Lily and your Aunt May all want you to answer the call. You're hurting them when you say no to Jesus." "No, I'm not." I spoke out loud, and I saw the people nearby turn around to look at me. At the sound of my voice, Daddy, who was a few yards away, faltered for a minute in what he was saying and glanced over in my direction. Aunt Bessie seemed to lose her head. She stood up abruptly, pulling me with her, and while I was still frozen in a dreadful paralysis, tried to drag me down the aisle toward my father. The two of us began a brief struggle that could not have lasted for more than a few seconds, but it seemed an endless, mortal conflict. My slippery patent leather shoes braced against the floor, my straw hat slatting cockeyed, lodging against one ear, my right arm twisting in the iron circle of the old woman's grip, my nostrils full of the dead leaf smell of her powder and black skirts. In an instant, I'd wrenched my arm free and darted up the aisle toward Mama, my aunts, and my brother. As I slipped past the pews in the darkness, I imagined I could feel eyes fixed on me and hear whispers. Although it was hot in the church, my teeth were chattering. It was the first time I'd won a battle with a grown-up, and the earth seemed about to cave in. I squeezed in between Mama and Aunt Lily just as the lights came back on in the church. In the baptismal pool, Daddy raised his arms for the last time. "The Lord bless you and keep you," came his big voice. "The Lord be gracious unto you and give you peace." What was curious was how uncannily subdued my parents were when they heard of my skirmish with Aunt Bessie. Normally they were swift to punish Matthew and me for misbehavior in church and for breaches in politeness toward adults. This episode combined the two and smacked of sacrilege besides. Yet, once I'd made an unwilling apology to the old woman, and as I kissed her, she shot me such a vengeful glare that I realized forever after it was warded to death. I was permitted, once we had driven home, to climb up into the green shade of the big maple tree I'd dreamed of throughout this service. In those days, more than now, I fell away into a remote dimension whenever I opened a book. That afternoon, as I sat with rings of sunlight and winged yellow seeds plopping down on the pages of the story of the treasure seekers, I felt a vague uneasiness in the back of my mind, a sense of having misplaced something, of being myself misplaced. I was holding myself quite aloof from considering what had happened, as I did with most serious events. But through my reading, I kept remembering the way my father had looked when he'd heard what happened. He hadn't looked severe or angry, but merely puzzled. And he'd regarded me with the same puzzled expression, as if he'd just discovered that I existed and didn't know what to do with me. After that Sunday, through some adjustment in the adult spheres beyond my perception, all pressure on me to accept baptism ceased. I turned 12, 15, then 18 without being baptized, a fact that scandalized some of the congregation. However, my parents, who discussed everything else, never said a word to me. The issue and the episode that illuminated it was surrounded by a clear ring of silence that for our garrulous family was something close to supernatural. I continued to go to New African. In fact, continued after Matthew, who dropped out abruptly during his senior year in high school. The ambiguousness in my relations with the old church gave me at times an inflated sense of privilege. I saw myself as a romantically isolated religious heroine, a sort of self-made Baptist martyr. At other times, I had a feeling of loss that I was too proud ever to acknowledge. I never went up to take my father's hand, and he never commented on that fact to me. It was an odd pact, one that I could never consider in the light of day. I stored it in the subchambers of my heart. It was only much later, after he died and I left New African forever, that I began to examine the peculiar gift of freedom that my father, whose entire soul was in the church, and in his exuberant, bewitching tongue, had granted me through his silence. Okay, I thought I would read another story, a much more recent one from this last collection, a story that also appeared in the New Yorker. And this is very different. It's set in Madagascar. And, well, I'll just read it. It's called Brothers and Sisters Around the World. I took them around the point toward Zamanzar, Michel tells me, those two little whores. Just 10 minutes. They asked me for a ride when I was down on the beach bailing out the Zodiac. It was rough, and I went too fast on purpose. You should have seen their titties bounce. He tells me this in French, but with a carefree lewdness that could be Roman. He is, in fact, half Italian, product of the officially French no-man's land, where the Ligurian Alps touch the Massif Central. He's in love, like so many of his Mediterranean compatriots, with boats, with hot blue seas, with dusky women, with the steamy belt of tropics that girdles the earth. We live above Cannes in Mougins, where it's always sunny. But on vacation we travel the world to get hotter and wilder. Islands are what Michel prefers, in Asia, Oceania, Africa, the Caribbean, it doesn't matter. Any place where people are the color of different grades of coffee and mangoes plop in mushy heaps on the ground. And the reef fish are as brilliant as a box of new crayons. On vacation, Michel sheds his manicured ad-man image and with innocent glee sets about turning himself into a Euro trash version of Tarzan. Bronzed muscles well in evidence, shark's tooth on a leather thong, fishing knife stuck into the waist of a threadbare pareo, and a wispy, sun-streaked ponytail that he tends painstakingly, along with a chin crop of Hollywood stubble. He loves me for a number of wrong reasons connected with his dreams of hot islands. It makes no difference to him that I grew up in Massachusetts wearing LL Bean boots more often than sandals. After 8 years of marriage, he doesn't seem to see that what gives strength to the spine of an American black woman, however exotic she appears, is a steely Protestant core. A core that in its absolutism is curiously cold and Nordic. The fact is that I'm not crazy about the tropics, but Michel doesn't want to acknowledge that. Mysteriously, we continue to get along. In fact, our marriage is surprisingly robust, though at the time of our wedding, my mother, my sister, and my girlfriends all gave it a year. I sometimes think the secret is we don't know each other and never will. Both of us are lazy by nature, and that makes it convenient to hang on to the fantasies we conjured up back when we met in Milan. Mine are the French gentleman adventurer, and his of a pliant black goddess whose feelings accord with his. It's no surprise to me when Michel tries to share the ribald thoughts that run through the labyrinth of his Roman Catholic mind. He doubtless thought that I would get a kick out of hearing about his boat ride with a pair of African sluts. Those girls have been sitting around watching us from under the mango tree since the day we rolled up from the airport to spend August in the house we borrowed from our friend Jean-Claude. Michel was driving Jean-Claude's car, a Citroën so rump-sprung from the unpaved roads that it moves like a tractor. Our 4-year-old son, Lele, can drag his sneakers in red dust through the holes in the floor. The car smells of failure, like the house, which is built on an island off the northern coast of Madagascar, on a beach where a wide scalloped bay spreads like 2 blue wings melting into the sky in the wild archipelago of Lemur Islands beyond. Behind the garden stretch fields of sugar cane and groves of silvery, arthritic-looking ylang-ylang trees whose flowers lend a tang of Africa to French perfume. The house is long and low around a grandiose veranda and was once whitewashed into an emblem of colonial vainglory. Now the walls are the indeterminate color of damp, and the thinning palm thatch on the roof swarms with mice and geckos. It has a queenly housekeeper named Aditya, whose perfect pommes frites and plates of crudité, like the dead bidet and dried-up tubes of bain de soleil in the bathroom, are monuments to our friend Jean-Claude's ex-wife, who went back to Toulon after seeing a series of projects, a frozen fish plant, a perfume company, a small luxury hotel, swallowed up in the calm fireworks of the sunsets. Madagascar is the perfect place for a white fool to lose his money, Michel says. He and I enjoy the scent of dissolution in our borrowed house. We fuck inventively in the big mildewed ironwood bed, sit in happiness in the sad, bottomed-out canvas chairs on the veranda after a day of spearfishing, watching our son race in and out of herds of humpbacked zebu on the beach. The only problem for me has been those girls. They're not really whores. Just local girls who dance at the Bar Caribou on Thursday nights and hang around the few French and Italian tourists hoping to trade sex for a T-shirt or a hair clip. They don't know even to want Ray-Bans yet. This is not the Caribbean. I'm used to women from the Comoros Islands who crowd onto the beach near the house dressed up in gold bangles and earrings and their best lace-trimmed blouses. They clap and sing in circles for hours, jumping up to dance in pairs, wagging their backsides, laughing, and flashing gold teeth. They wrap themselves up in their good time in a way that intimidates me. And I've come to an understanding with the older women of the village who come by to bring us our morning ration of zebu milk, or to barter with Rideau Richelieu, the beautiful Muslim cutwork curtains that they embroider. They are intensely curious about me, l'Américaine, who looks not unlike one of them, but who dresses and speaks and acts like a foreign madame, and is clearly married to the white man, not just a casual concubine. They asked me for medicine, and if I weren't careful, they'd clean out my supply of Advil and B-Mixin. They go crazy over Lele, whom they call the bébé métis, the mixed baby. I want to know all about them. Their still eyes, their faces of varying colors that show both African and Indonesian blood, as I want to know everything about this primeval chunk of Africa floating in the Indian Ocean, with its bottle-shaped baobabs and strange tinkling music. The sega, which is said to carry traces of tunes from Irish sailors, or the girls squatting under the mango tree stare hard at me whenever I sit on the beach or walk down to the water to swim. Then they make loud comments in Malagasy and burst out laughing. It's juvenile behavior, and I can't help sinking right down to their level and getting provoked. They're probably about 18 years old, both good-looking, one with a flat brown face and the long, shining hair that makes some Madagascar women resemble Polynesians, the other darker, with the tiny features that belong to the coastal people called Marina, and a pile of kinky hair, tinted reddish. Both are big-titted, as my husband pointed out, their merchandise spilling out of a pair of Nouvelle Frontière T-shirts that they must have gotten from a tour group leader. Some days they have designs painted on their face in yellow sulfur. They stare at me and guffaw and stretch and give their breasts a competitive shake. Sometimes they hoot softly or whistle when I appear. My policy has been to ignore them, but today they've taken a step ahead, gotten a rise, however ironic, out of my man. It's a little triumph. I didn't see the boat ride, but through the bathroom window I saw them coming back. Squealing and laughing, they floundered out of the rubber dinghy, patting their hair, settling their T-shirts, tying the cloth around their waists. One of them blew her nose through her fingers into the shallow water. The other one said something to Michel, and he laughed and patted her on the backside. Then, arrogantly as two Cleopatras, they strode across the hot sand and took up their crouch under the mango tree, a pair of brown netsuke, waiting for my move. So, finally, I act. Michel comes sauntering inside to tell me, and after he tells me, I make a scene. He's completely taken aback. He's gotten spoiled since we've been married, used to my American cool, which can seem even cooler than French nonchalance. He thought I was going to react the way I used to, when I was still modeling, and he used to flirt with some of the girls I was working with, some of the bimbos who weren't serious about their careers. That is, that I was going to chuckle, display complicity, even excitement. Instead, I yell, say he's damaged my prestige among the locals, say that things are different here. The words seem to be flowing up into my mouth from the ground beneath my feet. He's so surprised that he just stands there with his blue eyes round and his mouth a small O in the middle of that Indiana Jones stubble. Then I hitch up my bikini and march outside to the mango tree. Va-t'en, I hiss to Red Hair, who seems to be the top girl of the duo. Go away. Ne parle plus avec mon homme. The two of them scramble to their feet, but they don't seem to be going anywhere, so I slap the one with the straight hair. Except for once, when I was about 10, in a fight with my cousin Brenda, I don't believe I've ever seriously slapped anyone. This, on the scale of slaps, is half-assed, not hard. But in the second of contact, I feel the strange smoothness of her cheek and an instantaneous awareness that my hand is just as smooth. An electric current seems to connect them. A red light flickers in the depths of the girl's dark eyes, like a computer blinking on. And then, without saying anything to me, both girls scuttle off down the beach, talking loudly to each other and occasionally looking back at me. I make motions as if I'm shooing chickens. Allez-vous-en, I screech. Far off, down the beach, they disappear into the palms. Then I go and stretch out in the water, which is like stretching out in blue air. I take off my bathing suit top and let the equatorial sun print my shadow in the white sand below, where small white fish graze. I feel suddenly calm. At the same time, my mind is working very fast. My dear, who invited you to come halfway across the world and slap somebody? I asked myself in the ultra-reasonable tones of my mother, the school guidance counselor. Suddenly, I remember another summer on yet another island. This was in Indonesia a few years ago, when we were exploring the back roads of one of the Moluccas. The driver was a local kid who didn't speak any language we spoke and was clearly gay. A great-looking kid with light brown skin pitted with a few acne scars and neat dreadlocks that would have looked stylish in Manhattan, a Princess Di T-shirt, and peeling red nail polish. When we stopped at a waterfall and Michel the adventurer went off to climb the lava cliffs, I sat down on a flat rock with the driver, whipped out my beauty case, and painted his nails shocking pink. He jumped when I first grabbed his hand, but when he saw what I was up to, he gave me a huge ecstatic grin and then closed his eyes. And there it was, paradise. The waterfall, the jungle, and that beautiful kid with his long fingers lying in my hand. It was Michel who made a fuss that time, jealous of something he couldn't even define. But I had the same feeling I do now, of acting on instinct and on target, the right act at the right moment. Mama, what did you do? Lele comes running up to me from where he's been squatting naked on the beach, playing with 2 other small boys from the village. His legs and backside and little penis are covered with sand. I see the boys staring after him, one holding a toy they've been squabbling over, a rough wooden model of a truck without wheels, tied with a piece of string to a stick. Ismail says that you hit a lady. Word has already spread along the beach, which is like a stage where a different variety show goes on every hour of the day. The set acts are the tides, which determine the movements of fishing boats, pirogues, and sailboats. There's always action on the sand. Women walk up and down with bundles on their heads. Bands of ragged children dig clams at low tide, or launch themselves into the waves at high tide. At high tide. I'm really tired. That was an interesting stuff. At high tide, to surf. I don't even want to examine that one. With a piece of old timber. Yellow dogs chase chickens and fight over shrimp shells. Palm branches crash down on corrugated iron roofs. Girls with lacy dresses and bare sandy shanks parade to mass. The little mosque opens and shuts its creaky doors. Gossip flashes up and down with electronic swiftness. I sit up in the water and grab Lele and kiss him all over while he splashes and struggles to get away. Yes, that's right, I told him. It's the firm, didactic voice I use when we've turned off the Teletubbies videos, and I'm playing the ideal parent. I did hit a lady, I said. She needed hitting. I, the mother who instructs her cross-cultural child in tolerance and nonviolence. Lele has a picture book called Brothers and Sisters Around the World, full of illustrations of cookie-cutter figures of various colors, holding hands across continents. All people belong to one family, it teaches. All oceans are the same ocean. Michel, who has watched the whole scene, comes and tells me that in all his past visits to the island, he's never seen anything like it. He's worried. The women fight among themselves, or they fight with their men for sleeping with the tourists, he says, but no foreign woman has ever gotten mixed up with them. He talks like an anthropologist about loss of face and vendetta. We might get run out of here, he says. I tell him to relax, that absolutely nothing will happen. Where do I get this knowledge? It is sifted into me from the water and the air. So as we planned, we go off spearfishing over by Nosikomba, where the coral grows in big pastel poufs like furniture in a Hollywood bedroom of the 50s. We find a den of lobster and shoot 2 and take them back to Jean-Claude's house for Adija to cook. Waiting for the lobster, we eat about 50 small oysters the size of mussels and shine flashlights on the beach in front of the veranda, which is crawling with crabs. Inside, Lele is snoring adenoidally under a mosquito net. The black sky above is alive with falling stars. Michel keeps looking at me and shaking his head. Adija comes out bearing the lobster magnificently broiled. To say she has presence is an understatement. She got married when she was 13 and is now an important personage. After 8 children, the matriarch of a vast and prosperous island clan. She and I have gotten along fine since she realized that I wasn't going to horn in on her despotic rule over Jean-Claude's house or say anything about the percentage she skims off the marketing money. She has a closely braided head and is short and solid as a boulder. On the spectrum of Madagascar skin colors, well toward the darkest. This evening she's showing off her wealth by wearing over her pareo a venerable Guns N' Roses t-shirt. She puts down the lobster, sets her hands on her hips, and looks at me, and my heart skips a beat. Hers, I realize, is the only opinion I care about. Oh, madame, she says, flashing me a wide smile. Shaking her finger indulgently, as if I'm a child, I begin breathing again. Oh, madame. Madame has a quick temper, Michel says in a placating voice, and Adija just throws her head back and laughs till the Guns N' Roses logo shimmies. She's right, she exclaims. Madame a raison. She is a good wife. Next morning, our neighbor Pierluigi pulls up to the house in his dust-covered pickup. Pierluigi is an Italian and back in Italy has a title and a castle. Here he lives in a bamboo hut when he's not away leading a shark-hunting safari to one of the wild islands, a day's sail to the north. He's the real version of what Michel pretends to be, a walking, talking character from a boy's adventure tale with a corrugated scar low down on one side where a hammerhead once snatched a mouthful. The islanders respect him and bring their children to him for a worm cure he's devised from papaya seeds. He can bargain down the tough Indian merchants in the market, and he sleeps with pretty girls, pretty tourists and island girls impartially. I hear your wife is mixing in local politics, he calls from the truck to Michel. while looking me over with those shameless eyes that have gotten so many women in trouble. Pierre Luigi is 60 years old, but he's still 6'4" and the best-looking man I've ever seen in my life. "Brava," he says to me. "Good for you, my dear. The local young ladies very often need things put in perspective, but very few of our lovely visitors know how to do it on their own terms." After he drives off, Michel looks at me with respect. "Well, I can't say you don't have guts," he says later. "Then you really must be in love with me." In the afternoon, after a siesta, when I emerged on the veranda from Jean-Claude's shuttered bedroom, massaging oil into my hair, smelling on my skin the pleasant odor of sex, I see, as I somehow expected, that the two girls are back under the mango tree. I walk out onto the burning sand, squinting against the glare that makes every distant object a flat black silhouette, and approach them for the second time. I don't think we're in for another round, yet I feel my knees take on a wary, pugilistic springiness. But as I get close, the straight-haired girl says, "Bonjour, madame." The formal greeting conveys an odd intimacy. It's clear that we are breathing the same air now, that we have taken each other's measure. Both girls look straight at me, no longer bridling. All three of us know perfectly well that the man, my European husband, was just an excuse, a playing field for our curiosity. The curiosity of sisters separated before birth and flung by the caprice of history half a world away from each other. Now, in this troublesome way, our connection has been established. And between my guilt and my dawning affection, I suspect I'll never get rid of these two. Already in my mind is forming an exasperating vision of the gifts I know I'll have to give them. Lace underpants, Tampax, music cassettes, body lotion, all of them extracted from me with the tender ruthlessness of family members anywhere. And then what? What, after all these years, will there be to say? Well, the first thing to do is answer. "Bonjour, mesdemoiselles," I reply in my politest voice. And because I can't think of anything else, I smile and nod at them and walk into the water, which, as always in the tropics, is as warm as blood. The whole time I swim, the girls are silent, and they don't take their eyes off me.
Lost my voice totally.
Would you two be so kind as to answer a few questions? You want to come on up? I know you're jet lagged, but you still got to come up.
I'm managing.
Afterwards, after we ask a few questions, there'll be food and drink at the back of the room, and we invite you to join us and consume good things. So questions, comments? You get here, and I'll stand to the side.
We want to know about your pocket handkerchief. I said, we want to know about your pocket handkerchief.
Well, lining up. There you go. I'll let you touch it later. Questions, comments? Don't be shy.
I feel very exposed.
This is your opportunity. Ask Andrea Lee and Jamaica Kincaid anything you want.
Anything. We could talk about
Go ahead, DiCarpio.
Jamaica. The question is, the story that was not well received has a lot of echoes with Annie. And I was wondering, if did the story make it into Annie? Is that how it went? Or are the echoes just there? Am I just hearing them and they're not actually there?
Well, it's the same author, and also I wrote it before. Those stories, in a way, are just, I think, rehearsals for what I was going to do later on. So they're sort of sketches I now see.
I want to ask you, did you, I mean, only black women at the New Yorker, Charlene Hunter-Galt's gone. Did you take an immediate dislike to each other? Come on, be honest.
No,
we went shopping. We went shopping. We had a great time together. Now, how did we saw each other? The thing is that you don't really socialize. We used to see each other whisking by in the halls and be curious, and then somehow we discovered we disliked the same person, which remained nameless. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
And that made us fast friends. So.
No, we liked each other.
Yeah, we
very
liked each
much.
other.
And I remember it was Matsuda, who was a Japanese designer, and
This is the person you don't like?
No,
No,
it
no,
was a
no.
dress where we went shopping.
We went shopping, and that would really confirm the difference between Jamaica and me, because I felt so incredible. I was wearing like a little ruffled blouse, and I remember you trying these incredibly sort of avant-garde things, this curiously constructed thing, and I felt terribly provincial.
Oh, God. No, we liked each other.
Yeah, we did.
So you probably sued your short story first in the New Yorker.
Yes, except for 3 stories in my first book, they were published all in the New Yorker, and then you were publishing.
Yeah, I was doing first nonfiction, and then I started out with I just kind of started with that story about New African, which turned into a short story, and then the others just came, and then I just kind of kept on going. But I was writing fiction before that, but that was the first New Yorker fiction. And you were writing that piece about eggs. Did you ever finish the egg piece?
Yes, I thought of myself that I would be a reporter, and I remember Mr. Sean saying that I was a terrible reporter, and the only person worse with facts than me was George Trow. Do you remember George?
Yes, I do. I do remember that piece, though, that you told me about.
I
thought
I was going to write about eggs the way John McPhee had written about oranges, or maybe it was Bill Whitworth. Do you remember the profile of the orange? I thought, what a great idea. Of course, I can't. I'm not a reporter. I can't write reporting at all. I can't.
Oh, it seemed almost surreal. You talked about this eggs.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was going to be a very long piece on eggs, like a 2-part piece on eggs. And I remember being terrifically impressed by that.
It all remains in my mind.
But we used to do Talk of the Town pieces together, and you were the one who taught me about Beat the Clock and Break the Bank. Is that right?
Oh, God.
You define that for everybody.
All right. Writing talk stories was the deadline was 5:15.
We were all kind of poor in New York,
Yeah.
and sort of the lowly people in the office. So we tried to make money by writing.
Right, and the longer you wrote, the more you'd get paid. So we were always trying to write long things. And the Beat the Clock was keeping Mr. Sean in the office until, because he couldn't leave if you were writing talk. And we would fool around all afternoon, and finally, at about 5 o'clock, even though the deadline was 5 o'clock, we'd start to write. We would just write, and Mary Painter would call and say, "Is it ready yet? Mr. Sean is waiting." And so we had this thing called Beat the Clock, and then you'd write longer and you'd be paid more. But I would just spend all my money. When you talked about shopping, I was thinking, my God, I'm always spending more money than I
remember that, yes. And I remember walking down the street with you, and you said, "This must stop."
I'm still saying this must stop.
I remember it so very well. That's why we tried to break the bank.
Yeah,
so that we could
so
shop.
Gosh,
That was a long
I'm
time
an American.
ago. That was
I
a very
love
long
that.
time ago. But it all comes back now looking at these old pieces, which I haven't looked at.
They're great pieces.
Yeah.
Questions, comments? Please. Yes. Would you stand up, please?
Sure.
And would you say your name?
Bert Ash. And my question is for Andrea Lee. Why so long in between books?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I was just kind of, I've been writing the whole time. I just kind of was doing articles and got sidetracked by doing journalism and didn't do books. And now all of a sudden I'm interested in doing books again. So I really, I ask myself that because I don't know how the time went by. It just did. And now all of a sudden I'm very, very interested in doing books again. And in fact, I've thrown myself into a novel now.
Hey, that's great.
So, yeah. So there's really no excuse. I don't know. Time flew. And it's very funny to see you because it just seems not very long ago.
God.
Kim DeCosta. Stand, please.
Andrea, I was an undergraduate here when I read Sarah Phillips, right across the street in Cafe Pamplona. And part of what I loved about it was that part of it was set here, when you talk about the Carpenter Center. And I wanted you to say a little bit about how your experience here as a student made it into the book, and in what ways it did.
That's very interesting. I don't really know how. what to say about it. I think that basically what happened at Harvard was just a continue. I went to a really good, a very good prep school before that was very oriented toward, great. They had a great English department. I feel that mostly what happened at Harvard was just studying writing and studying literature, not in particular. I mean, socially, I just kind of made a boyfriend and holed up and didn't socialize or do anything in particular. So, I think that mainly what was going on at Harvard was just reading and reading and reading and writing. And I had the great opportunity of working with Robert Fitzgerald and William Alfred, and Anthony Hecht, and great people. So basically, I was just kind of holed up doing that. I can't really say that it had much. I avoided, I didn't have many friends. I wasn't a social, I didn't socialize very much at all. So it's hard to know. I mean, it's hard to say that it had very much effect on what I wrote about. It does enter into a couple of stories, but it's mainly an apprenticeship, I'd say.
Yes. Would you stand up and say your name, please?
Could you share some of your creative process or writing habits? Or
I have no writing habits. I wish I did. I write when I can, and when and by when I can, I mean when it seems. I write a lot in my head, and then I put it down on paper. But I don't really have what you'd call good writing habits, and I don't. As for the process, I would hesitate to speak about it, because I think that then it would become perhaps a little bit known to me, and then in regards to myself, I'm one of those people that familiarity breeds contempt. But I only limit this sentiment to myself. So I'm not familiar with my writing.
You said a really wonderful thing, and it might become known to you. In fact, that's what I dread.
Yes.
I dread discovering how it works, because then it just stops.
Yes, yes.
Questions, please, comments. Yes. In the back, then this woman.
I have
Yes.
for Jamaica. You talked about being a young writer, America goes on style.
What's your name?
My name is Sandy Coleman. And I wanted to ask for you, what was it that kind of aided that development? How did you get from being a young writer and sort of messing around to becoming a author?
Oh my goodness, how did I get? I aged. I just went from year to year, and then it's true, I aged. That's is the answer.
I think that.
My name's Holly Campbell, and for either of you, I just wondered what your inspirations were that got you started writing way back when you started. Who or what inspired you?
You go.
Well, in listening to just before Annie rang, and listening to, usually people criticize me and for being too angry, but listening to when I could listen to Professor Fisher's introduction, I thought all the things that I had thought about were finally I found a reader. I had one great reader before, my editor at the New Yorker, and then he died. And now I see I found a really extraordinary reader again, because my inspiration, or if you can call it that, is my family and my history. And I find the notion of forgiveness intolerable, and closure and all that sort of thing. I write out of what you might call an unhealed wound, and I hope there will never be a Mercury comb for it. You know what Mercury comb? Well, yeah. Yes, the unhealed wound is my inspiration, and my history, or whatever, however I interpret those things.
Your turn.
Questions?
No,
Andrea?
I can't. No, you did that so well. I will leave it that. We'll answer another question if possible.
Okay. Another question? Yes, in the back.
Andrea, this is for you.
Mm-hmm.
Do the fiction writer and the journalist in you fight, or do they like each other, or how's that?
No, I think that the fiction writers always they do kind of struggle against each other. I think I'm more of a fiction writer than a journalist, so I'm always tempted to embroider events and to make them much more interesting than they complete than they actually are. It's very hard for me to think that I have to put down a conversation exactly as recorded. I don't think I'm a very good journalist. So,
Another one.
What?
Another one.
Exactly. No, yeah, I think there's definitely a war, and definitely the fiction writer.
Giving you a lot of stories, do you think, your experiences?
I think just life gives me a lot of stories. Yeah, I mean, looking around. I think journalism is just. I think writers are nosy and curious people who are always poking around. And so doing journalism, I guess, has allowed me to poke my nose into more situations. But as I say, I don't think I'm a very good journalist because I'm rather shy and I don't really like going and questioning people. I like observing them and nosing around in that way. So, I think I have had more opportunity to look at people perhaps because I've done journalism.
There's another hand in the back, yes.
I feel so fortunate to be in your presence, both of you, because you are my heroes. But
Would you say your name while you think?
last time I was here at Harvard, I was at Mem Hall at an event that was the artist response to September 11th. And Jamaica Kincaid spoke, and she was the only brave voice. Everybody else was waving the flag and being witty. And I wonder, now we are a year and a half or so beyond that event, and I wonder if you've had to catch a lot of flack for what you said that evening, and if you are brave enough in America right now to write some of the things that you started to say that night at Mem Hall.
What'd you say, Jamaica?
You want to know what she said? I wasn't there.
I've said them other places, and I was hissed at the New York Public Library. And what I said was just what most people in Cambridge, anyway, think. I just said the dissenting thing, and I don't. I would be brave enough to say them again, but I don't care. I think the country will go on or not, and I have 2 children and I worry about them, and all of this seems to have a life of its own. I don't talk about it anymore, and it's not because I don't say those dissenting things, but I'm tired of it, and it's just not. We'll go to war, we'll kill people, and then the people who are left will have children, and we'll kill them, and they'll kill us, and I will have a drink.
Andrea, I want to ask you, you live in exile, as James Baldwin or Richard Wright would say. You live in Torino.
Yes.
And Richard Wright, many critics feel, and I agree, that his writing suffered when he went abroad. How do you manage to stay in touch with as they say, the wellspring of your art?
That's curious. That's an interesting question. I think it can be damaging to live away from your home country, and I think people do kind of plunge into doing nothing, basically, especially when they get to Italy. There's something very bad about Italy because you can get into lifestyle there and then completely forget about what working well means. But I don't know. I just fanatically do it. I fanatically read and keep in touch and travel back and forth. And the curious thing is that now that I live in Italy, I live in a place that seemed exotic to me a long time ago, and that fascinated me and drew me. And now that Italy is every day to me, what seems exotic and what draws me is Philadelphia of my childhood. The thing that I thought was the most prosaic, the most flat, the most boring thing now fascinates me, and I'm seeing all sorts of depths and nuances, and in fact I'm going back to write about Philadelphia, about the United States, about where I grew up. Now I dream about that, which is very, very funny. You know, there was when I was at Harvard, there was a pine tree outside of Hillis Library. I don't know if it's still there. I haven't gone and looked at it. And I would go by that, and it reminded me of Greece whenever I went by. And I think, oh my God, I've got to get out of here and get away to Greece. And I find myself now in beautiful Italy thinking about that pine tree, but with nostalgia for the pine tree in Cambridge, not for Greece anymore. So it's very curious. I think being away, and if you do it in the right way, and you focus on your past, I don't know, it can give you a good perspective. So I do it really fanatically almost now, so reading.
Great. How about you, Jamaica? You live in soon-to-be Cambridge, in Burlington, Vermont or someplace. How do you stay in touch with the islands?
Well, when I'm in the islands, I can't write at all. I'm overwhelmed by the sensation of being there, and I need to be away from it. But I think a lot of people might have, as you say, if you do it the right way. I don't know if I've done it the right way, but I write about water culture, a seawater culture, while living in a landlocked area. And the more landlocked it is, the more deeply I can imagine this, the opposite of that. So I am the sort of person, but I live in contradictions. I am the sort of person who needs the opposite of what I'm writing about. So I need to be incredibly comfortable and well off to write about my poverty-stricken childhood.
She also is the only black member of the only synagogue in Burlington, Vermont. Now, that's a way to stay in touch with Antigua. The last question. Yes.
I'm Nawali, and I wanted to know if there's any current contemporary fiction that excites your interest, particularly black fiction, or if you sort of keep yourself secluded from that in order to keep your own style going.
Apart from each other, you mean?
It's hard to know. Contemporary fiction, contemporary black fiction. Well, of course, I follow, and I deeply admire Zadie Smith.
He'll be here next week.
He'll be there next week, which wish I could be here next week. It's hard to know. I kind of go back and forth. I don't really, so to speak, I encounter books, and so I just, I like them. Just like right now, I'm kind of looking backwards. I've just rediscovered Isaac Babel. So, who's not black or modern or contemporary or anything like that, but suddenly it's just a great, great passion of mine. So it's for me, it's just caprice, really. I can't really say. What about you?
Well, I've just done. I tend not to read fiction anyway, but among the things the last few, months now, I've just been obsessed with. This crumpling part of the world called the Himalayas. That's all I read about, is just people climbing up the icy sides of mountains and dying in avalanches. And so that's, I don't read, again, because I am writing, well, I'm actually writing about the Himalayas, but when I'm writing fiction, I tend to read nonfiction. And when I'm writing nonfiction, the only nonfiction I write now is about the garden, and when I'm writing about the garden, I read about the garden. So I'm just in a world of nonfiction for the most part.
Yeah, sometimes sometimes if you're writing fiction, if you read another writer whose style is too strong, it could be a wonderful writer, but if it's the wrong kind of style, it can infect your own style, and that's bad. And there's certain writers who might be what you need to read when you're writing something in a certain way. Right now I'm experimenting with a slightly different style, and so they're writers who I'm reading. Babel is one of them, and Marguerite Duras is another, translated, of course. But but there are certain writers right now I can't read because if not, they kind of overpower me because I'm very, I don't know, I guess you absorb things.
Well, let's see. 2 exiles, right? 2
Sounds
New Yorker
sad,
writers.
doesn't it?
2 degrees from
I like
Harvard.
that.
She's a
2
professor at
daughters.
Harvard. And 2 daughters who will be fresh persons in this
Luckily
coming
they're not
September.
here.
Let's thank Andrea Lee.